All right. My guest today is Azran Osman-Rani, the co-founder of Naluri. For those of you who don't know, Naluri provides an integrated digital care solution that combines support for both physical and mental health. Thank you very much for being here, Azran.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Kevin.
Very cool. So anybody that knows me knows that I always start with the origin question. So take me
Sure.
back. How did you start the entrepreneurial journey in the first place, and how did you land on Naluri?
Cool. So Naluri is my third venture that I've built. The first was an airline from startup to IPO 6 years later. And then my friends and I started iFlix, which is sort of like the Netflix for emerging markets, scaled that to 20 million users in 20 countries in 3 years. That got sold off to Tencent. And in 2017, a coffee conversation led to the genesis of Naluri because two ideas. One, when we reflected back on how we started iFlix and how over 100 investors had rejected us because they said five guys in KL don't stand a chance against a global giant like Netflix. But luckily, we did get investor number 116 on board. And what we showed is, as great as a product as Netflix is, Southeast Asians and people across the broader Asia region don't really watch Hollywood shows in English, don't have credit cards for payment, don't have high-speed broadband, right? And so you got to tailor something that's much more locally relevant to the culture and infrastructure here in Southeast Asia. And another conversation led to health. And I think why this is important is because some of the themes across both the airline at AirAsia X and iFlix was always about how do we make things more affordable and accessible to the mass market. And as we talked about the need for health similarly, I was triggered looking back at how I had lost my father to diabetes and cancer. And what I noticed was the medical system was only taking care of his physical health. Take this medication, do this surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy. But when someone's going through a condition like that, now we realize that what he went through was depression and anxiety. And when it's untreated and unsupported, it led to skipped chemo sessions, missed medication, which made things worse, right? And so I felt that the healthcare system was very siloed, right? And there wasn't a way to provide support, especially mental health support for people with these chronic conditions. And also looking back, access to these services are, very hard in Southeast Asia. It's not affordable. And could I perhaps take some of my lessons learned from iFlix and apply to build a new venture here in Southeast Asia? And that one coffee conversation led to 60 other conversations and led to starting the team.
Okay, I love how it's kind of a navigation of a variety of entrepreneurial journeys because there's not really a whole lot of corollary between an airline to iFlix on the health, but the stream of entrepreneurship and kind of the desire to do something tailored to the local environment, etc. There is a bit of a common thread
Mm,
across those, yeah.
yeah.
So you mentioned the challenge with getting investors. So I have to revisit this. Since a serial entrepreneur, when you're on your third one, considering a successful exit, etc., was it a little bit easier going to market the third time, or still the same challenges?
Not at all. In fact, we've done five funding rounds at iFlix alone. So this would be my 12th round across the three ventures. And the most recent one this June was the absolute hardest.
Okay.
So it doesn't get easier, but you're more familiar with the pain.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Do you at least have more people on your phone to where you can call up? You start getting, you don't have to worry about the cold calling as much anymore because you're a
You're right.
familiar name.
Sure. In that sense, yes, it does help. But similar percentage of being ghosted and being declined and kind
Yeah.
of polite dragging on still happens.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a common thread. There's oftentimes more no's than there are yeses, and sometimes people aren't friendly enough in order to give the no right at the beginning. So you have to just kind of follow it where it may lead.
That's right.
So tell me then. So after all of these coffee conversations, when you're settled on the idea, you're wanting to build. What did the MVP look like at first when you went to market to begin with? What was that process to get the
Sure.
MVP up?
So there are two things. One was I wanted to talk to as many people in the healthcare industry, from hospital directors and specialists to insurance CEOs and HR directors, and one, whether the problem that I wanted to tackle was a relevant problem for them. And second, the approach that I wanted to tackle is different from what they already have going. And while I was doing that and getting that feedback, the other thing I did was to build a pre-MVP, as in a minimum non-viable product. And that product was literally just WhatsApp, right?
Okay.
I had a psychologist. I posted on Facebook to see whether people wanted to have a chat with psychologists, because step one, whether text-based chat was something people were open to instead of live one-on-one conversations, whether through that people would actually open up to their hardships and challenges, and whether we could actually entice or guide them to want to do something about it. And in that process, for example, you discover that the psychologist needed to ask very similar questions or explain the same concepts over and over again, and that meant taking up a lot of time. So my one intern started to design using PowerPoint and screenshots, kind of structured questions and A box, B box, C box, that you can send it as an image and someone can reply B, which is a lot easier, right, than typing and waiting for a response. And from those, kind of 50 pilot projects on WhatsApp, you realize, wow, like, people were opening up and they were crying and being emotional because they had never kind of surfaced these issues that they kept deep buried inside of them. And, quite a number were really motivated and felt supported to want to get healthier. So that led to me saying, hey, you know what, there's something here. I kind of, in the 60 conversations, I found my co-founder, Jeremy, Dr. Jeremy. He's a medical doctor and healthcare system specialist. And we both agreed we're going to build the first product using our own cash, and then get it to a stage where we can raise the first seed round.
Okay. And you have experience building product in the past before. So was
Yeah.
was was it a little bit smoother dealing with kind of, the fast build, not having to, being a little bit smarter about not having as much legacy tech debt as you're scaling up and so forth? Or is it this pretty similar sort of build as you go, iterating, not sure what the end product is going to look like? You're just kind of moving quick.
Look, I don't think it was certainly as smooth. Like, you look back and you think, boy, there were 10 different decisions we could have done differently. But it is better, I think, than the first time you're creating something completely from scratch, because in this case, unlike the other ventures, when you're just using money out of pocket, we started with only one part-time software engineer. And we had to make some quick decisions about the architecture and the tech stack. But luckily, I had experience with AWS and sought guidance from them, so that at least some of the foundational work is a little bit more robust, that we could build on from. But still, I mean, we've had to rebuild the entire front end, re-architected the whole back end with Amazon in the first couple of years.
Okay. So you end up deciding to build this. You have one part-time software engineer on staff. What comes next? Do you start going out and trying to sell it into market, or are you still in the testing phase where you're trying to get more test people on board?
Yeah, definitely. Even when we had what we would call crude MVP, as in, it's a functional product, you can download it from the App Store or Google Play. That would have been April 2018, but the first paid client was September 2018, right? So there's still a lot of, let's give it out there, let's test it out, get feedback. You realize, for example, even in May, we did sort of an initial partnership with one of the insurance companies who just happened to have launched a first digital insurance product targeted at millennials, right? And so Naluri was offered as like a free add-on if you buy that insurance. And what we discovered is they were not interested at all at using Naluri, because at the point that you're buying insurance, and especially if you're a millennial, I don't have a reason to want to change my life. Similarly, another pilot where we talked to this big organization who said, a big chunk of our healthcare costs are our retirees. Can you
Mm.
do something with them? Especially because a lot of them were dealing with diabetes. But
Mhm.
if you've been living with diabetes for 10, 20 years, and here someone gives you an app and you're 60 years old, you'd be like, no, I'm good. It's all in the hands of God, right?
Mm.
It's fate already that I'm in this condition.
Mhm.
But we then discovered that the best or optimal use case was the point when someone is first diagnosed.
Okay.
And for example, an insurance company would know because they would get the first claim, right? Maybe it's for metformin, an early diabetes drug. So someone's just been diagnosed with diabetes or hypertension. And if you go to them and say, hey, we'd like to support you with helping you manage your condition. Here's how you can do it online. Then it started to make sense, and there was some traction with usage.
Okay, so the key entry point, it's interesting how you kind of navigated through to try and find what the ideal customer persona, the ideal use case would end up being. So
Mhm.
it really comes down to the partnerships with the insurance company as being that first point of recognition, or perhaps, I guess, have you migrated a lot heavily into the service providers as well as also being kind of the first recognition point for the same diagnosis example?
Yeah. So the first two partnerships were with two different insurance companies, and they were because the CEOs were part of my initial 60 conversations, right? Being able to reach out to them, say, hey,
Yeah.
here's what I want to build, and they got excited because it just happened to fit with their new product launch agenda. But
Okay.
even then, it was still very small test and pilot projects. The main kind of client that came on board was one of our largest energy companies here,
Mhm.
where the head of health was looking for a digital health solution. They only were familiar with the telehealth or telemedicine platforms that were available here. And they realized that they needed to take a preventive approach to health, because when their engineers or technicians get unhealthy and can't work on the plants, it's a massive opportunity cost.
Mhm.
And somehow, he met someone from the Ministry of Health who said, hey, you know what? I met this guy, Azran, who's building something that sounds, very targeted at your need. Why don't you reach out to him? And here's his mobile number. And that
Mhm.
led to one conversation. And that actually became our first real paid program that today is still kind of a foundational client for us.
Okay. And has that then been kind of setting the stage for how you go out and approach clients, taking that one kind of foundational starting point and saying, okay, now I just need to replicate all of the steps and the use case to kind of iterate on that.
Well, I wouldn't say we nailed it in the first part, but what we
Mm.
discovered is that unlike insurers, employers are much easier to engage, because not only do they have to bear the burden of direct medical costs,
Mhm.
but they also value indirect cost, i.e., productivity loss from absenteeism or presenteeism, or in this case, when the technical workers can't work on the plant because they're unhealthy, the replacement cost or the opportunity cost is massive.
Mhm.
Whereas insurers are mainly focused on only when you are medically claiming something,
Yeah.
right? So the value of improving that is a lot less. So
Okay.
that then kind of really got us to focus a lot more on reaching out to corporate clients and having one reference clients, because our first project was successful, gave us the reference for us to reach out to banks and telcos who called that first client and said, are these guys from Naluri real? Oh, okay, they're doing good work. Great, we'll start with them.
Okay. And how, as you start seeing all of this, how's the product development kind of keeping pace with some
Mm.
of these realizations as well? How are you maintaining the balance?
Mm. Well, maybe at a higher level, right? When we first started, the idea of saying, hey, we have psychologists and we wanted to provide mental health support, even for those with diabetes or hypertension, there was a lot of reluctance, right? Their focus was, Azran, you know what? Thank you, but I think your doctor and your dietitian and your fitness coach can be um, more relevant, because they can clearly see the direct connection. And digital made sense, right? Because these are employees in remote locations that you can't send medical personnel to and check in on them almost every day. And so, in a way, our psychologists were these hidden Greek soldiers in the Trojan horse, called a diabetes management program or a high blood pressure management program, because the psychologist was still instrumental, because you needed to get to the moods, mindsets, and motivations of these employees to want to change. Because if you only told, a doctor said, you know what, you got to cut down on your fried rice and exercise more, they'd be like, yeah, I know that, but that doesn't compel them to actually want to make a difference, right? So that's kind of how we started. And then COVID happened. And suddenly mental health became front and center, because our clients started to see and experience real burnout and disengagement and resignations, and unfortunately even suicides. And they needed a digital mental health service, because we were all in lockdown. We were all, working remotely. The traditional model of face-to-face therapy broke down. And we just happened to be at the right place and right time, because we had an existing set of, maybe 20 clients then, right, that reached out for us. And we grew threefold during COVID, because of suddenly how mental health became front and center for these large employers.
Okay. And do you see any challenges with breaking some of the stigmas around mental health? Was having it as a digital accessibility something that could actually overcome that? Because I know in many parts of the world, there's not always an openness in order to speak to somebody, especially if you have to physically be in front of somebody.
Absolutely. I like to say, if zero was completely stigmatized, no one will talk about it, and 100 is complete acceptance. COVID brought us from 3 to 15, right? So we fivefold, but we still have a long way to go.
Okay.
But I think what made that difference, number one, was top business leaders making this a priority, right? I had group CEOs of the largest banks and telcos and oil and gas companies saying, guys, this is a priority for us. We're providing the service. It's completely confidential, because we want to make sure that you're taken care of. Number one, that made a difference. Digital, I think, does help, especially with the under 40 segment, who are much more familiar and comfortable with apps. But even as we start to add things like 24/7 care lines, right? If you're really in a distressed state, I don't want to download an app and sign up. I just need to call someone and talk to someone immediately. 2021, we launched our first WhatsApp service. Turns out 6 times as many people, when they're in a distressed state, reaches out to WhatsApp when we're giving them an option. 24/7 counselors, psychologists readily available to support you on WhatsApp versus call, right? Click 2 buttons, 6 times as many preferred WhatsApp. So text create that slight asynchronous communication creates a little bit more distance than picking up the phone and talking to a human. And of course, that allows us to then, take a lot of that text-based data, use our NLP algorithms to help kind of quantify emotional sentiment, distress, so that we can prioritize who needs what help when.
And there's always a live person backing each of these interactions, is it?
Yeah. So we're not at this point believers in, chatbot only, but how can we use AI and tech to tenfold the productivity of a psychologist? So if you only are doing telehealth or telemedicine, and we're, kind of having a conversation like what we're doing now, when I talk to you, I can't talk to anyone else. And in that model, a psychologist would be maxed out at 50 clients per month. Ours, the full-time Naluri psychologists, are already at 500 to 1. Because you move things from synchronous to asynchronous, you add in a lot of the digital self-help tools that people can do on their own, and the psychologist can be guided by the algorithms or decision support systems. Who should I pay attention to? We've grown from 100 to 1 4 years ago, 300 to 1, and now 500 to 1. And that allows us to drive down the cost of professional healthcare.
So 500 to 1 is the number of actual individual users, and the
that
one is
an individual psychologist supports. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so that's primarily associated with simply getting smarter about how to integrate technology into filtering, gating, prioritizing, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Exactly. Or for example, imagine if we start a conversation and I want to know, what are the stress triggers in your life, right? if I have to ask you questions, wait for you to reply, and then I've got to explain to you, okay, here's what depression means versus clinical depression, right? It takes up a lot of my time. Now I can say, hey, Kevin, when you got 10 minutes later during the day, just click on this link. It'll take you to a lesson that you can answer these standard questions, and then I can review them when I'm done. And the computer's also analyzing your questions because it's a standard structured questionnaire that we can compare live to 100,000 other people who've done that, right? And give me the psychologist insights that would have just been harder to pick up as quickly on my own with just notes, right?
Okay. So getting onto how the product has now expanded and built up, and you've scaled it many times over. You know, when you're looking at Malaysia, it seems like you've landed a few big clients that have operations all across. When you look at the further expansion, how many countries are you currently operating in?
So we're live in 4, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand, and we'll likely launch the Philippines in 2023.
So tell me about the process of replicating the product into a new market, because I imagine there's a couple of barriers, but I imagine there's more if we really got into it. But
sure.
Certainly having a live psychologist backing it, you need to find somebody that has local language, the dialects, etc., etc. What's the process like of replicating, and any lessons that you might have learned that you'll apply to the next country?
Well, our first attempt in 2021 completely failed because you're trying to hire someone purely remotely. We couldn't travel and expect them to somehow get what you're trying to do, and for them to pitch to clients and hire local healthcare teams in each of these markets. It flopped. It wasn't until 2022, this year, when we could travel. My co-founder relocated in Singapore. And I spent 2 to 3 weeks almost every month in Jakarta to really build up the teams there, hire people, sit down with them, that it's finally making a big difference. So one, it's just the effort that's needed, right? I think as founders, we've got to be there on the ground in person, and especially to get the first set of clients. While let's say you can hire a commercial director, they've got to observe you, right? And of course, as a Series A startup, you don't have the luxury of hiring like the top rainmakers, the big guns who are working with the unicorn. So you've got to work with what you can. And that means as founders, we have to be on the ground to lead it. The second thing, I think, is to then focus on, number one, our clients who have regional operations, right? So one of them, right, an airline that has affiliates in Indonesia and Singapore and Thailand, and they'll be like, well, great, can you also serve our employees in these markets? Likewise with one of the global insurers. So that gives us a beachhead, right? Like you can have work and reference clients from your existing clientele. The second is to see clients or potential clients from the same industries. So because we started to understand, what's unique about, different telecom company employees and the stresses and issues and conditions that they're wrestling with in Malaysia, we can go to a telco in Indonesia and share, this is what we've learned, right? Likewise with an airline. So it allows us, I think, to kind of win them over, right? Because we bring some level of familiarity with their industry. And so that allows us to get those sets of clients as well. And then, of course, once the local business development teams are on the ground, they have the experience, hands-on experience with the first set of clients, they've now been able to go out and get their clients, and also the care delivery team can service the employees from those clients.
Okay. I love the very tactical approach to how to build the customer base. Like looking at regional players to get the beachhead, leveraging on specific industries so that you can speak to the particular pain points. I think those are great lessons that other people can use and apply, no matter what the type of startup that they're building is.
Yeah.
When you look at launching in new markets and you're hiring on talent, how do you balance those sort of intrinsic characteristics, especially with a salesperson, even in a country that may be speaking in an entirely different language? Like you go to
Mhm.
Thailand, Malaysia to Indonesia, there's enough similarity between the languages, but they're obviously quite different.
Yes.
But how do you balance that? Because the culture, the approach to sales, all of these are quite different from market to market.
You know, honestly, even Malaysia and Singapore are more different than they are similar, right? It's
Mm,
a lot more nuance.
yeah.
And what you learn is you can't get Malaysians flying down there and somehow convincing Singapore clients to come on board, right? Let alone Indonesia.
Mm,
Thailand, of course, as you're right, like completely different language and
mhm,
culture. Um, so I think similar to my experience at iFlix, it's hard, but it is possible to find sort of, let's say, for example, a Thai country head who comes from that similar background. For example, both my co-founder and I used to work with McKinsey, so consulting background. You find someone similar, they kind of have the same kind of language and thought process,
mhm,
so it's easier to integrate. And that helps a lot. So they're much more comfortable with even English, right?
mhm.
Versus if you take someone who isn't hard. And so the second Indonesian country or commercial director that we hired, he had gone to school in the US, right? So much more westernized than someone who grew up purely locally. So it
Mhm.
helps to bridge that cultural gap, right? Or
Okay.
otherwise it is hard. It will
Okay.
create problems.
And it is the starting point to hire a country director, or do you hire the more junior staff levels first? Which one comes first when you go into a new market?
So we always over-index on being top heavy, even in our
Mm,
home market. Uh, you know, for a Series A startup, every investor has said, you are the top heaviest Series A company we've met. Um, but that's just for us. We'd rather get a really good solid team of, let's say, 8 to 10 leaders, and the
mhm.
the junior team might be there. But if you don't have enough leadership talent, we are the bottleneck. We're the constraint, right?
Okay.
So it is a big bet, but I think it is important.
Okay. Well, let me take on that point because
Mm,
to pull on that thread a little bit, I think probably what they may be getting to is when you have a lot of senior staff, especially if you're pulling somebody from an MNC or something like that that has a lot of support staff, they may not always be ready to roll up their sleeves. So
mm.
how do you build that kind of culture within the organization that, it's time to roll up the sleeves, everybody's getting into it?
Yeah. So we've had we tried to bring in two very senior directors from more traditional large companies,
Hmm.
and it failed. The ones who've succeeded, frankly, were because of personal relationships, right? Tim, my CTO, was working with me at iFlix.
Hmm.
Aiden, our chief commercial officer, had worked with Jeremy at McKinsey. So on one hand, I am. It makes me anxious because we might kind of develop this risk of group think. We're not bringing
Hmm.
people with more broad experience, but I think maybe pre-Series B, it's better to err on the side of senior teams that are comfortable with each other, because the risk of in our case, bringing let's say a data science director and medical affairs director from outside, it didn't work because they were just not used to it and didn't buy into the whole startup iterative culture, daily stand-ups.
Yeah.
It was very alien for them.
Okay. Yeah, it's a completely different environment. I've heard a lot of stories. I'm sure you have a number of experiences as well of just like it's not always a fit. It's quite different between startup land and corporate world.
Yes.
Hmm.
What excites them when they're outside thinking, oh, you guys are much more nimble and fast, we're too bureaucratic. The moment they come in, they crave that stability and structure, right? And they
Yeah,
struggle with
yeah.
that uncertainty.
Yeah, you gotta be there's a certain personality that thrives in that uncertain environment and loves kind of there's a bit of chaos to it
Mm.
because it is fast, it is moving, there's a lot of responsibility, so it's a different personality type.
Exactly. Yeah.
which is really tough to hire for, to be honest with you, because and as well when you're talking about junior hires, to be able to escalate them and
Mm.
onboard them, train them to where they become the next generation as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's look forward a little bit. So you mentioned that you have plans in the working to expand into the Philippines, but looking more broadly from a
Mm.
vision standpoint, when you
Yep.
look forward, how do you define success as an
Yes.
organization? What does it mean to you?
Okay. One, that Naluri becomes what's called a standard reimbursable, meaning you are, insured, and oh, you've got diabetes, you've got mental health, you've got hypertension. Naluri, you can standard claim under your health insurance product. The second, doctors prescribe it, meaning, you come to a doctor says, you know what, I'm going to diagnose you as being hypertensive. I'd like you to use Naluri to support you in that program. That's kind of like for us, the gold standard that we want to get to. Getting there will be hard, right? Because that's why we take a very data-driven approach to work with insurers. They want, for example, 5 years of data so that they can really feed into the actual models and create these coverage that today doesn't exist. Mental health coverage doesn't exist in Southeast Asia. We want to be the first to help create that, make that happen. And doctors are the most conservative, right? They'll want to know, has the Ministry of Health endorsed this, right? I don't want to get into any legal problems, right? An app, that sounds, alien to many of them, right? So it's hard, but that's our goal. That's our aspiration. And that's the standard that we want to aspire to.
Okay. So you mentioned metrics and so forth. So I'm curious, when you look at your own business, is there a single metric? Maybe you call it a North Star metric. Maybe you call it something else. Is there something that you're guiding yourself towards?
Well, ideally for us, it's the kind of the value of health that we improve from the lives that we improve, right? Because on one hand, yes, we count, for example, today we've supported over 300,000 lives. Most of them are employees of our clients. But we're now starting to quantify, right? Because, for example, if I help you bring down your weight by 5 kilograms, there's a certain value to that, which might be different from an 8-kilogram reduction. Bringing your depression score by 22% versus bringing your depression score by 47%, there's a different economic value to that, right? So you want to both increase reach, but also increase kind of the value of health that you improve. And so if there was one metric, it would be one that combines both.
Okay. That would be interesting to see, to be able to quantify the economic impact of the improvements across those health factors, escalated by the number of patients that are actually doing that.
That's what we're obsessed about.
Okay. I got to dig on that a little bit,
Sure.
a little bit more, but like, how do you envision the connection in order to be able to quantify the economic value of a 5 kg weight loss, average weight loss across the 300,000, for example?
Yeah. So I guess for us, we're lucky that one of our partners, who's also one of our investors in Series A, is the largest third-party administrator here in Malaysia, and they're doing a roll-up across Southeast Asia. So they serve corporate clients, and we work with them to dig into 500,000 employees, 10 years worth of medical claims data. We then layer on top of that sick leave data, right? So if we can understand the profiles today, what sort of costs historically have they been claiming? How many days off more than the kind of average healthy person that they take? And then you can value that, right? So there's, if someone who is, for example, let's just take weight's probably easier, right? Like if they're at a 35 BMI, everything else being normalized, what's kind of the average medical claims for that sort of profile versus someone at 30 versus someone at 25 versus someone at 20? So we use that data set initially, and what we tell clients is, as you help, we work with you with your own data, that model becomes a lot more personalized to your population.
Sure. Interesting. And I'd imagine that you could even extend on more fuzzy concepts of like when they're not taking leave, there may be productivity sacrifices
Yes.
because, even though I didn't take leave, I'm a little sluggish today, so I'm just not getting the same amount of output.
Yes. So
Much
that's
harder to
presenteeism.
quantify.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are kind of standard international models to estimate
Mm.
that. That's based on a self-declaration. So we do use that so that we can at least put an estimate to that. So while it's not so robust, it's the first time for many companies, in fact, most companies, to actually see presenteeism being quantified.
Mm-hmm. So then let me transition into like what you can do in order to accomplish this target goal. So when you look at trying to get this type of outcome statement,
Mhm.
sometimes people love to try and boil it down to we need to get this one thing absolutely right, maybe with two things. Do you look at the business that way? And is there one thing that you identify that you must absolutely obsess over to achieve that goal?
Well, for us, it is what we call health data sets, right? So
Mm,
today we have 300,000 depression, anxiety, and stress data sets and 30,000 blood test data sets. So we measure blood sugar, cholesterol, weight, blood pressure. And that's the starting point, right? And I think as we work with reinsurance companies, for them, wow, that's the first time they've seen it, but they'll want to know that data on a longitudinal basis. So not just a snapshot, but tell me, how does that evolve at month 12, at month 24, at month 36? Because if it comes back to that key vision, if you want to create something where insurance companies go, right, I can now add mental health coverage to my corporate insurance product, that data is going to be so crucial, right?
mhm.
And frankly, doctors may also be much more inclined to prescribe it if they know, oh, insurance companies will pay for this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Very, 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 very interesting how that ends up playing out. Let me wrap things up here, if I
Sure.
may, with my standard closing questions. The first one is, what is a tech tool that you just can't live without?
Wow. For me, mine is my Google Calendar. And specifically, I'm obsessed about color coding it.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got different colors for internal in-person meetings, internal virtual meetings, external in-person meetings, external virtual meetings, time for me to think, time for me to plan. Everything is mapped out, right? So for example, Mondays at 8 a.m. is my private thinking time, right? 12 to 1's private thinking time. And Google Calendar also helps you measure that, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you're like, wow, I'm way too focused this last 3 weeks with external clients and investors and not really paying attention to the team inside. How can I recalibrate that in the coming
Mm-hmm.
week? So I am obsessed about kind of managing my time, and Google Calendar helps us to quantify that. They've got these insights that you can
Okay.
generate now, right?
Okay. Okay. I think you've just one up me on my level of calendar obsession. I am myself, but I think you've now one upped me. Last question
Sure.
here. So, if you were to talk to another startup founder that's just getting started, what would be the one biggest piece of advice that you could offer?
Um, so for me, right, when I look back, and I think right now in 2022, a lot of founders are very concerned about fundraising.
Hmm.
And I think the people who've invested in us were people that we connected with them 18 to 24 months earlier. They oftentimes decline first round, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one, you got to think way ahead. You got to connect with people, even if, for example, they might be a Series B investor and they might be, 4 years out, but you got to want to try to get to know them, tell them about what you're building, and keeping them posted, maybe with
Mm-hmm.
quarterly, if not monthly, simple, short 3 bullet point emails, so that at the right time, you're a friendly or a familiar name and story, and not 6 to 9 months out, you're
Mm-hmm.
only trying to get to know people.
I think that's fantastic advice. I mean, it's really a relationship business when it comes down to it. I mean, there's obviously a bit more to it than that, but no one writes a big check after meeting somebody for a couple of days. Well, I wouldn't say no one. I mean, there's certainly people in the news that have done it, but certainly like it's a long game building those
Sure.
relationships. I think that's phenomenal advice. And even, there is churn from one VC firm to another. So being able to follow up understand where your contacts are going. Somebody from a late stage may move to an early stage and there could be a fit. So I love that. I love that advice of just kind of playing the people game component of it.
Exactly. Right. And then maybe because when we are B2B, you realize, okay, I've got to manage these relationships as a funnel, right? If I want 10 clients, I've got to see 100, right? I've got to be able to pitch to 50, etc. And same thing with fundraising.
Yeah, I love that analogy actually, because I say the same thing to most startups that I discuss this with, is that it's managing a funnel. You need to understand kind of like qualified lead versus non-qualified lead. You need to go through the process of qualifying. You know, corporate sales, B2B sales, they're longer sales cycles. So you need to understand touch points, relationship, etc. Fantastic analogy. I love that.
Awesome.
Well, this has been a really great conversation, Azran. This is really illuminating in regards to what you're building. I love all the insights along the pathway, especially from a seasoned entrepreneur such as yourself.
Great. Well, happy to share.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, that wraps it up for another fantastic episode of the Sea of Startups. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Go onto iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. It's the best way for us to get discovered and to have these startup stories reach a broader audience. If you have any suggestions or would like to get in touch, you can email me at kevin@indelible.vc. As always, I'm your host, Kevin Brocklin from Indelible Ventures, and this is the Sea of Startups.